In the aftermath of the Great War, it's difficult to separate fact from fiction, history from myth, truth from legend. What is never in doubt is that in the autumn of 2281, a courier accepted a parcel that would change the course of their lives and the entire Mojave forever. This account is just one of the many that follow the courier through their journey. This is Legends of the Mojave. As he strolled into Novac, the courier took note of the town's layout. The west end of town mostly consisted of single-family homes with a large shack built on the outskirts. The east end of town mostly consisted of a fortified hotel, the Keep, the place everyone runs to if the town came under attack, and likely where anyone who was anyone called home. The dinosaur statue looming over the town was part of this complex. The off-ramp for the highway created a high wall and a single bridge into town, allowing for snipers posted in the dinosaur's mouth to have the settlement pretty well locked down from the east. Not a perfect defense, since all anyone would have to do would be to circle around and hit the town from the west. Then the snipers would be useless. But luckily, most raiders would be too stupid to think of that, and the Legion would have to either move in full view of the snipers, at least offering an early warning of trouble, or they would have to go through Ranger Station Charlie, and not even the Legion would be brazen enough to hit a well-fortified NCR garrison. So all things considered, this place would be safe enough to rest up for a bit and ask around for the dandy in the plaid jacket and his not-so-great con escort. He headed straight for the hotel entrance, but just as he was about to step through the gate, he caught sight of a familiar face from his past. A Robco Security Model 2060B sporting a friendly cowboy on its monitor, Victor. The courier's mind instantly flashed back to the conversation he had had with Johnson Nash back in Prim, how the job that had led him into a shallow grave had been commissioned by some cowboy robot. He had discounted the theory that this was Victor at the time because robots programmed to act like cowboys weren't exactly anything out of the ordinary. But this was one too many coincidences to overlook. Victor had been there when he was attacked, he dug him up and dragged him to Doc Mitchell's clinic, he had hung around Good Springs until the courier decided to head out, and now here he was, following the same trail as the courier. It was high time for some answers. The courier struck up a conversation with the bucket of bolts. He tried everything in his conversational arsenal to get useful information out of Victor. He tried being friendly, he tried being direct, he even tried a bit of trickery. Nothing seemed to work. Victor proved just as unhelpful as he had in Good Springs. You know, excluding the whole saving his life business. Once again, the courier had to break off his interrogation, having learned nothing useful from Victor. Again. Either he was barking up the wrong tree, or he needed to get his hands on one of these Securitrons if he ever needed a secret kept safe. The courier entered the compound and headed straight for the dino. Apparently it was actually a building, so whatever was inside had to be interesting at the very least. Turns out it was the hotel's gift shop from before the war. Now it was sort of the town's general store. Cliff Brosco, the proprietor, apparently hungry for a sale, tried to steer the conversation toward trade every chance he got. But the courier did manage to glean some useful information from him. The cons had indeed stopped off in Novac for a time, and the town sniper probably had a good idea of where they were heading when they left. So the courier ran up the stairs to the dinosaur's mouth. Problem was, the courier arrived at night. Apparently, Novac employed snipers on both day and night shifts, and Checkered Jacket rolled through during the day, so the courier had the wrong man. The night sniper, a man named Boone, did have a job for the courier. Seems his wife had gone missing recently, taken by the Legion. So much for safety in Novac. But nobody in town was able or willing to help figure out how they did it. Boone was convinced that it was an inside job, that someone had sold his family out to the Legion, and they needed to pay for their treachery. As an outsider, the courier was above suspicion, and would be able to talk to people without them trying to cheer him up or spare his feelings the way they would if Boone was doing the asking. The courier felt for him. He had just seen firsthand the sort of things that the Legion was capable of, and what happens when someone starts selling out their neighbors to the Legion. The courier wasn't about to sit back and watch Novac become another Nipton. The courier asked around the hotel, but didn't glean a lot of new information. Boone's wife wasn't well liked around town, so people weren't especially upset when she went missing. Nobody seemed to see anything out of the ordinary on the night she disappeared, and no one had an alibi either. This line of questioning was getting him nowhere, but the Courier did have one noteworthy encounter. While asking around the hotel, he met with one Bruce Isaac, a singer and entertainer. Mr. Isaac was terrified, obviously on the run from someone, but what struck the Courier is that he recognized this man. He remembered seeing him perform in New Reno. A memory. An intact, tangible memory from before his attack. Life experience, even if it wasn't particularly useful. The Courier wasn't sure what to make of it. Was this a sign that his memory was beginning to return? Had it been there all along and he just didn't have a use for it until now? Were his memories all still there, just misplaced? Lacking context. It was a monumental revelation, while being at the same time completely mundane and useless. At least for now. Still, it didn't change the Courier's mission, either of them. He bade Mr. Isaac farewell and continued asking around the hotel. By the time he had questioned everyone at the hotel, he still wasn't any closer to a suspect. He had even worked his way over to Manny Vargas, the daytime sniper. Vargas was sort of the town's favorite suspect, due to a pretty poor relationship with Boone's wife. But the Courier wasn't convinced. Vargas was pretty honest about his feelings for Boone's wife, negative or otherwise. But what's more, it was clear Boone and Vargas were close, and it seemed that Manny just wanted them to settle down in the same town and bro it up in retirement. Not exactly going to happen if you're selling your best friend's wife off to Legion slavers. More to the Courier's displeasure, Vargas claimed to have info on the Courier's attackers, but had a little quid pro quo in mind of his own before he would blurt out the details. If the Courier wanted to know where they were heading, he needed to clear out some ghouls out of the Repcon test site to the west of town. The ghouls were preventing the people of Novac from being able to salvage from the ruins, which was the town's major reason for being, and some of the ghouls had started to wander into town from a direction the snipers couldn't cover from Old Rex. Damn, this place was sounding less and less safe by the minute. It was decision time. Did he continue trying to help Boone to find out what happened to his wife, or head straight to Repconn so he can continue his own mission? It seemed like it should have been easy enough to simply drop Boone and take care of his own business. After all, he didn't know Boone from a Brahmin tit. But as he scanned the town, all he could see were the ghosts of Nipton. If this town did have a Legion collaborator, it was just a matter of time before they moved in and held another lottery. He wasn't in any mood to see that happen again, so Repconn would have to wait. Having exhausted any possible leads inside the hotel, the Courier decided to see if maybe anyone had seen anything on the west end of town. After all, if the Legion had taken Boone's wife, they would have had to have come from a direction the Overwatch couldn't cover. At the north end of town was a giant rundown shack, like the ones he had come across in Sloan, with options like the still standing pre-war homes on the southern end of town, or heck, the Poseidon station across from the hotel. It was a wonder why anyone would build that pile of tetanus, so the Courier decided to check it out. Inside, the Courier found the strangest thing he had ever encountered. Mannequins manning a sandbag bunker, tripwires and bear traps, signs of enough Nuka-Cola consumption to give a super mutant diabetes. And in the back, listening to the radio, a grizzled old man who looked like he knew a thing or two, maybe even seen a thing or two. Noonan, a man of many origin stories you might say, was crazier than a lake lurk turned legionnaire. He seemed to be aware of all the goings-on around town, but attributed the cause to all manner of supernatural and fantastical beings and myths. The McBride Brahmin Ranch had a number of cattle killed recently, apparently the work of an invisible chupacabra. Surprisingly, Nobark said the claims of ghouls in the Repconn site was just sensationalist nonsense. If this made the Courier feel any better about the task assigned by Manny, that feeling probably subsided when Nobark instead asserted that the site was haunted by commie ghosts looking to take some rockets up to the moon and paint a Lenin face on it. Worse than ferals, if you ask me. But of more interest to the Courier was Nobark's sighting of mole rat men who came into town at night to take their women to their caves filled with the latest appliances. And on the night of Boone's wife's disappearance, one of them ducked into the hotel office for a spell. He might have been nuttier than a bighorn or turd, but it was a lead. Something about the hotel manager, Genie May Crawford, seemed a bit off. She was the only one in town who seemed convinced that Boone's wife had just run off. As much as everyone around town seemed to dislike her, no one else seemed to believe that she would have just left Boone and set out on her own. Heading into the hotel office after hours, the Courier picked the lock on Genie May's safe. Not to steal nothing, mind you. Inside, he found a bill of sale, contracting that Genie May Crawford had sold Carla Boone to a Legion consul. with an additional payment to be made in the event that her unborn child carried to term. At no point was there any talk of the fact that Boone's wife was pregnant when she disappeared. It's possible that Boone himself didn't even know, or maybe they were just trying to keep it under wraps for the moment. In any event, Genie May had somehow learned of Carla's condition and decided to cash in. This act of heartless greed was exactly the sort of wickedness that the Courier had grown to despise. Novac didn't have anything even resembling a police force, and the NCR were as likely to deal with this situation as they were to make it rain. There were no other options. The Courier was the only one in a position to bring Genie May to justice and allow Boone a bit of closure. So he asked Genie May to follow him out onto the bridge east of town, and gave a prearranged signal to Boone, who was on duty in Rex. Genie May's slaving days had met a sudden conclusion, cut short by 147 grains of lead as it passed through her frontal lobe. If it was a victory, it certainly didn't feel like one. Boone's wife was still lost, their unborn child as well. Exacting vengeance on the person who shattered his family didn't make it any easier for Boone to stick around town, to accept what had happened. He needed closure, but his closure was tangled and now inextricably linked with a mission of vengeance that ran counter to the Courier's own quest for justice. For the Courier's part, it felt like yet another step in the wrong direction. He had taken this mission to do a bit of good for the people of Novac, to keep them safe from the Legion. But as was beginning to happen all too often, even by Mojave standards, the Courier had taken on the role of judge and jury. Even if Boone insisted on playing the executioner this time around, the Courier still issued the death warrant. The distinction between men he had looked down on, like Sheriff Myers back in the NCRCF, and himself was growing fuzzier by the day. Perhaps the Courier had been naive, even foolish to think anyone in this world would insert themselves into the day-to-day of others and not be forced to make these hard choices. The Courier snapped himself out of his ruminations. For now, he and Boone parted ways. Someday, perhaps, the Courier would return and help Boone take the fight to the Legion, but for now he needed to focus on getting the help he needed for his own goals. There were some loose ends to tie up around town before moving on to Repconn. An old retired ranger living in Novac had asked the Courier to check in on the rangers stationed at Checkpoint Charlie. It was an easy enough task, and Charlie was nearby on a fairly safe road. But when the Courier arrived at the station, he wasn't prepared for what he found within. The troopers stationed there had been slaughtered. Some were in their uniforms, some were in their underwear or still laying in bed. Their bodies were lying everywhere, booby-trapped for anyone searching for survivors, or trying to move the bodies for burial. If the blood-soaked carnage and defiled corpses left any room for uncertainty, the holotape next to the radio eliminated all doubt. This was the work of the Legion. There was nothing that could be done here, so the Courier returned and gave the bad news to Ranger Andy in Novac, accepted payment for his trouble, and headed over to the McBride Ranch as this was his last stop on his way west out of town. Time to deal with No Bark's Chupacabra. Turns out, No Bark's tale had a fair amount of truth buried within it, as there was indeed an invisible beast. Sort of. Turns out it was a nightkin, even crazier than No Bark, and packing a minigun that made it far more dangerous. After letting the McBrides know their herd was now safe, the Courier set out up the western road out of town. The Legion's noose was slowly tightening around Novac, and the Courier needed to get out before it was too late. It was finally time to drive the ghouls out of Reppcon. The road to Reppcon was straightforward, though not exactly what you would call easy. With high bluffs on either side, there was nowhere to hide, and no way to make an indirect approach to the facility. The path to the Reppcon test site, infested with ferals, forced the Courier to fight his way to the facility. Along the way, he found several ash piles, usually an indication that someone had come through with a hefty complement of energy weapons. But who could have been responsible? This was obviously not the work of ferals, and the people back in Novac were lucky to have anything more dangerous than a kitchen knife at their disposal, so there was apparently a third player. The Courier would have to be careful. The first thing he spotted when he entered the facility was a dead nightkin on the ground, and he was quickly greeted by a raspy voice over an intercom that could only come from a non-feral ghoul. The voice told him to head up to the top level of the facility, and was more snippy than an unhouse-trained gecko when the Courier tried to get more out of them. So he braved believed the facility infested with ferals, but thankfully no living examples of nightkin. When he reached the testing level, he was greeted by the voice on the intercom, though surprisingly, it was a non-ghoul in a lab coat. Chris Haversim didn't seem to think that was the case though, and was completely convinced that he had been a victim of ghoulification. He directed the courier to speak to someone named Jason. Everyone else on this level appeared to be ghouls, though thankfully they were all non-feral, and packing pretty significant energy weapons, explaining all of the ash piles on the way in. Jason Bright, true to his namesake, was a rare example of a non-feral glowing one. Jason spoke with a sort of religious fervor, and indeed was trying to lead this group of ghouls on some sort of great pilgrimage. He was disappointed in the courier for killing his feral followers, but he acknowledged that they had probably left him no choice. He spoke of demons that attacked them and drove them to the top level, and a voice that screamed at them from the intercom system, telling them to stay out of the basement. Unfortunately, their pilgrimage rested on reaching the rockets lying on the launch pad, insisting that a path must be cleared through the basement so they could continue their journey. It would have been easier if they were all just ferals. A few mag dumps and he could be on his way. But these people, despite the many prejudices against them and despite their unique beliefs, were still people, just as deserving of being here as the folks back in Novac. So his only option was to give them the things they needed to be on their way. He ventured down towards the basement door and couldn't help but notice that the nightkin corpses that graced the facility were more closely spaced the nearer he got to the basement door. 3 guesses what the demon on the intercom was. He tried his best to sneak through the basement, but when your adversary makes a habit of using stealth boys and congregating with others who use stealth boys, there's not a lot of chance of sneaking by them unnoticed. He came to a chamber occupied by a nightkin named Davison, apparently the leader of this group. Davison, despite carrying on a second conversation with a nearby Brahmin skull he called Antler, was at least non-violent-ish. He was willing to let the courier stay and even agreed to lead his nightkin away under the condition that the courier dealt with a ghoul who had been blocking their access to a stockpile of stealth boys. Davison may have been willing to play nice, but his nightkin brothers weren't so cordial, and the courier was forced to fight his way to the ghoul's stronghold. The ghoul, Harland, had made himself a defensible little death trap, but he had no way out without the courier's help, and even if he wanted to leave, he wasn't willing to leave without ascertaining the whereabouts of a lady ghoul he had grown quite fond of but had gotten separated from when they were trapped in the basement. If just one more person demanded a favor for a favor, the courier was considering suspending his ask first, shoot second policy. It was tough, but the courier was able to fight his way to the makeshift jail on the other end of the basement. The she-ghoul, unfortunately, had died in captivity. By this point, the entire band of nightkin had been picked off piecemeal, so at least it was an easy jaunt back to Harland to bear the bad news. A ghoul of his word, Harland got his rotten ass out of that place. Finally making some momentum on his mission, the courier stopped by to let Davison know the path was cleared at the stealth boys. But it seems that the blabbermouth Brahmin skull Antler whispered some sweet nothings into Davison's ears about the courier being behind the sudden demise of his followers, and the nightkin proved rather hostile. After dealing Davison out, the courier led the ghoul survivors through the basement to the rocket test site, where Jason revealed that their journey would take them into outer space, somewhere far from this broken world. Their ghoul physiology would allow them to subsist on the cosmic radiation they would be exposed to over their long journey. But Chris, the non-ghoul ghoul in their flock, would surely die if he attempted to join them. They never tried too hard to convince him that he wasn't a ghoul because his technical skills were required to launch their mission. But now they needed to be clear with him about his true identity, and who better to do this and convince him to keep helping than the courier. It was almost better to wander the Mojave blindfolded trying to find Checkered Jacket than it was to jump through all these hoops for the info Manny Vargas had. After a tough conversation with Chris, the courier finally convinced him of the truth of his condition. He wasn't a ghoul, he was just going bald. He even managed to convince Chris to keep helping the Bright Brotherhood in getting their rockets spaceworthy. After going out on a couple scrounging missions for some supplies they would need, the courier and Chris managed to get the rockets in shape to fly, so the Bright Brotherhood said their farewells and boarded their rockets. The courier went up to mission control and even spotted some inaccuracies in the mission parameters that he managed to correct, ensuring a safe launch and cutting years off the ghoul's journey. The courier couldn't say for certain, but something told him that never in his wildest dreams did he ever think he would be leading missions to launch men, or in this case ghouls, into space. It was done. Repconn finally fell silent. He sidled back into town to let Manny know the test site was once again safe for salvage. Chris Haversom had even moved into an empty room in the hotel complex and was trying his best to assimilate with humans again. At least the people of Novac had need of his engineering expertise, and he was making himself useful. The town had even gotten together and decided that the Courier deserved his very own room in the hotel for everything he had been doing around town. At least there was some reward for all this running around. Even if he didn't plan on spending any more time than was absolutely necessary in this hellhole, it felt nice to be part of the community again, a feeling he had been dearly missing since leaving Goodsprings. Manny was grateful for the Courier's help, and gave the info that the Courier had been waiting for so patiently. The Repconns had headed to Boulder City. The man in charge hadn't squared up with them by the time they reached Novac, and Boulder City may have been where they planned to settle accounts. But more importantly, Checkered Jacket had a name. Finally, a word to describe the man that had haunted the Courier's dreams, motivated his every actions, and dictated every step he had taken since Doc Mitchell eased him out of his gurney. Benny, the man in the plaid. Benny, the man traveling with the Repconns. Benny, the man who was last seen headed for Boulder City. The Courier bid Manny goodbye and stepped out from the streets of Novac onto the on-ramp for Highway 95. With renewed vigor and steadfast resolve, he fixed his gaze northward. He finally had a target, not some amorphous nemesis wrapped in fancy textiles that had wronged him. Benny, the man who would never see him coming.